A clock struck 12, yet its ticking revealed a darker truth. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're watching from. Your voices make these mysteries even richer. In bringing to the public the particulars of the affair which I have named the clock that remembered murder, I am once more reminded of how narrow is the door between the commonplace and the extraordinary. There are crimes that shout their intention from the housetops, brutal, obvious things that any steady fellow with a uniform and a notebook might pursue. And then there are other matters, delicate, half-whispered puzzles, which, had they fallen into other hands, would have remained forever among the unindexed secrets of London. It is of one such matter that I now write. The year was 1894, and the winter had come upon the city with a drear persistence. The fog lay low in Baker Street, not as a passing scud of vapour, but as a living thing that pressed against the windows and dulled the very sounds of wheels on the roadway. Within our rooms, however, there was warmth of a kind I have never found elsewhere, a fire that crackled cheerfully, the pleasant disorder of books and chemical apparatus, and, most of all, the singular atmosphere which attended my companion's presence, an air of alert quiet like the hush in a theatre before the curtain goes up. Sherlock Holmes was stretched at full length upon the sofa, that long, spare figure of his, thrown into relief by the lamplight. A pipe had gone out upon the table beside him. He had the look of a man who has been intensely awake inwardly, while outwardly at rest. His eyes, half-lidded, were fixed upon the ceiling cornice, as though some problem there had taken possession of his mind. For my own part, I sat near the hearth, attempting to occupy myself with a medical journal, though I confess my attention wandered to him in that habitual fashion of mine. "You're not reading that, Watson," said he presently, without turning his head. I laid the paper down with a laugh. Not with any profit, at least. Your method of detecting idleness is as unerring as your method of detecting crime. My method is founded upon observation of small fact, he replied languidly. For example, the third finger of your right hand shows a faint indentation which it did not possess yesterday at luncheon. It is the mark of a tight, elastic band. Therefore you have been sorting letters or papers this morning in a manner unfamiliar to you. "Very good," I cried, "but surely that could have any number of explanations?" "Only one which fits the other circumstances. Your boots are still spattered with the fine grey mud of Wigmore Street, and your coat carries the faint odour of the post office. You have been to the General Post at least once since breakfast, and you have returned with correspondence which you have been arranging. The indentation is the last link." "Then I am laid bare," said I. "Not quite. You came by the Marylebone Road route, not Oxford Street, because your cuffs are touched with soot from the omnibuses that pass the railway arch." "You make me a mere walking advertisement for the city's filth," I protested. He smiled, that faint, private smile which was in him a substitute for laughter. "You see, my dear fellow," said he, sitting up and reaching for his pipe, "there is nothing in our daily life too small to yield a conclusion. It is the trained mind that sifts significance from trifles. The same principle applies to murder." He had no sooner spoken the last word than there came a sharp rap upon the sitting-room door. A businesslike summons, brisk enough to suggest urgency, but controlled enough to belong to someone accustomed to being admitted. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual quiet deference. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it is a matter of life and death." Holmes's eyes brightened in an instant, as a man's might who hears the first notes of his favourite music. "Show him up." A moment later, the visitor was ushered in. He was a tall, well-groomed man of perhaps 45 years, with iron-grey hair brushed severely back from a high forehead. His coat, though of good cloth and cut by a respectable tailor, bore the slight creasing at the elbows that comes from constant use rather than ornament. His face, clean-shaven and lined, might have been called handsome but for a twitch at the corner of the mouth and a restlessness about the eyes. Those eyes, I observed at once, had the peculiar look I have seen in men who have not slept for many nights. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "My name is Reginald Alderwick," said he, and his voice was steady in spite of the pallor of his cheeks. "I am the proprietor of Alderwick and Son, clockmakers, of Clerkenwell. I have come to you because Scotland Yard is—" he halted, searching for the right word. "Because Scotland Yard is magnificent in matters of force and lamentably clumsy in matters of reason." Holmes waved him to the chair opposite. "My friend Watson and I are private practitioners of reason," said he. "Pray take your time and tell us what has occurred." The man sat, then stood again, as though the chair were too small for the agitation within him. At last he forced himself down. His hands were singularly fine, the hands of a craftsman, though now they trembled slightly. "It began with a clock," he said. Holmes's eyebrows rose the fraction of an inch, which in him represented surprise. "Clocks have begun many things," he murmured. "They have begun punctual railway journeys, regrettable meetings, and even more regrettable marriages. How did your clock begin this?" Alderwick drew a breath. "Yesterday morning I was called to the house of Mr. Lionel Eastbury. At the name I saw Holmes's eyes narrow with recognition. "Eastbury of Wimpole Street?" he asked. "The same, a collector, a wealthy gentleman who has spent the better part of 10 years acquiring rare timepieces, French bracket clocks, Dutch long cases, German musical clocks, you name it. His collection is celebrated among those who understand such things." "And you have serviced them?" "For years. I was summoned because a new acquisition of his, a peculiar mantel clock, had begun to misbehave, as he put it in his note. I went at 11 o'clock. The servant admitted me, and I was shown into the music room, where the collection is kept. Mr. Eastbury was there. He was dead." The words fell into our quiet room with a heaviness beyond their simplicity. In London, men die by violence often enough, yet there is still something arresting in the blunt statement of it. "Dead?" echoed Holmes softly. His whole posture had changed. He was no longer languid, but coiled and awake. "How?" "Murdered," said Alderwick. "That is what they say." His throat had been cut. "Who found him?" "I did." The room was locked from the inside. I knocked. There was no answer. The servant said he had been inside since 10 and had given orders not to be disturbed. When we could get no response, the servant fetched a key. He opened the door. I was at his shoulder. Mr. Eastbury lay on the Persian rug before the fireplace. Holmes leaned forward. "The servant's name?" "Hopkins. An old fellow. Has been with the family 3 years. "Any other persons in the house?" "Yes. Mrs. Eastbury, his wife, and Miss Morland, her sister, were upstairs. A maid and cook were below. No one else." "Continue." Alderwick's gaze drifted for a moment toward the fire, as though he saw, in its red shifting, a more terrible scene. "The police were sent for at once. Inspector Lestrade came himself. He questioned me for over an hour. He questioned the servant. He questioned the women. But, Mr. Holmes, there is something in this death which makes no sense. There is something unreasonable about it." Holmes's fingers steepled. "Unreasonable deaths are my favourite sort. Tell me what is unreasonable." "It is the clock," said Alderwick, and for the first time his voice shook. "The clock that I was sent to examine." He drew from his coat a folded handkerchief, carefully tied. It was the manner of a man carrying something fragile. With great delicacy he unwrapped it and revealed a small object which, even to my inexpert eye, was of remarkable character. It was a mantel clock 8 inches high, fashioned of dark walnut. Its case was plain enough, yet there was a subtle elegance in the curve of the pediment and the narrow fluting of its pillars. The dial was ivory, stained faintly with age, and the numerals were not Roman but a curious blend of Arabic and stylized flourish, such as one sees in certain continental pieces. Most striking of all, however, was the glass. It was cracked in a spider's web, starting from the upper left corner as though struck by a small hard object. Alderwick set it upon the table between us. It ticked softly, steady, precise, almost soothing in the hush of the room. "This," said he, "is the clock that remembered murder." Holmes took the little clock in his long, nervous hands as a violinist might take up a new instrument. He did not at once open it or turn it over, but held it lightly, listening to its beat. I have more than once remarked upon the curious intimacy with which he could make himself acquainted, not only with men, but with inanimate things. Under his scrutiny they seemed to confess their histories. "A handsome piece," said he at last. "Not English." "No, sir. It is a Viennese clock, though of a rather uncommon school. It came to Mr. Eastbury from a dealer in Harlem. The workmanship is admirable, but the escapement was capricious." "Was?" Holmes glanced up. "It is functioning now," said Alderwick. "It was not yesterday morning, or so Mr. Eastbury's note alleged, yet when I saw it, it was running with perfect regularity." Holmes set it down and drew it nearer to the lamp. "The crack in the glass is fresh," he observed. "Within a day, I should say." "And there are faint brown marks upon the lower rim of the dial," said Holmes, peering closer. "Not rust, not oil. Dried blood, perhaps, caught in the lip of the brass." "You did not remove that, I take it?" "No, sir. I touched nothing. Lestrade told me to bring the clock here exactly as it was. He meant to keep it at the yard, but—" Alderwick spread his hands helplessly. "He is convinced the murderer is already known. He thinks the clock is a curiosity, perhaps a weapon. But I could not rest without asking you to see it." Holmes's eyes had that far-away brightness which comes into them when a case begins to take form in his mind. "Lestrade has a suspect, then?" "He has," said Alderwick grimly. "And that is another unreasonable thing. He accuses Mrs. Eastbury's sister, Miss Clara Morland." "On what grounds?" "Because she was engaged in a bitter quarrel with the deceased not an hour before his death. The cook overheard them in the passage, and because—" Alderwick hesitated. "Because a razor was found in her room with a spot of blood upon it." Holmes neither exclaimed nor frowned. He merely looked attentive. "Ah," said he, "the old combination of quarrel and razor, which is as dear to the police mind as a nursery rhyme to a child. And the door locked from within?" "Lestrade says Mr. Eastbury locked it himself for privacy and that Miss Morland had a duplicate key. He claims to have discovered that she once had such a key when she was staying there 3 months ago." "And does she still have it?" "She swears she does not. She says she returned it. She says she was in the upstairs sitting room with Mrs. Eastbury at 10:30 and never left until the alarm was raised." Holmes smiled faintly. "Swears, says claims. Words are the paint with which people disguise their true surfaces. But the facts, Watson, the facts will not be painted over so easily." He turned again to Alderwick. "Tell me, Mr. Alderwick, precisely what you saw when the door was opened. Don't interpret, just describe." The clockmaker steadied himself, clearly grateful for the firm direction. "The music-room door is at the end of a corridor. Hopkins the butler went ahead with the key. I was beside him. He unlocked it. We entered at once. The curtains were half drawn. It was a grey morning, but there was enough light. Mr. Eastbury was on his back, his head toward the fireplace, his feet toward the door. His right arm was bent under him, his left was stretched out. There was blood upon the rug and here and there on the furniture. On what furniture? On the corner of a small cabinet to the left of the fireplace and upon the lower part of the mantel itself. Not smeared, sir, spattered. Holmes glanced at me quickly, and I knew that he had taken in more from that quiet detail than Alderwick imagined. The clock was on the mantel. Yes, it stood just here. He indicated a position with his finger as though the mantel were before him. Near to the centre, not far from a bronze urn. When I first saw it, its hands were stopped at 20 minutes past 10. Stopped, Holmes repeated. Yes, I remember it well because I glanced at it by habit. I thought, if it has stopped, I shall soon be at work. But even as I looked, it gave a little shiver, if I may put it so, and began ticking again. The second hand moved. It went on as if nothing had occurred. At that moment, said Holmes quietly, within a minute of our entering. Holmes's gaze returned to the cracked glass. And the crack, did you notice it then? I did. It was not in the note Mr. Eastbury sent me. It must have happened after he wrote. Just so. What else? Nothing touched, nothing moved. The room was tidy. There was a small writing desk by the window with letters upon it. A chair had been overturned near the centre. Mr. Eastbury's dressing gown was open as if he had risen in haste, and there was a smell, an odd one, like hot metal or scorched dust. I thought it came from the clock. Holmes nodded, his face still composed, yet I could see the threads drawing together behind his eyes. Very good. Now the note which summoned you, do you have it? No, Lestrade took it, but I remember its words almost exactly. Dear Alderwick, the little Viennese clock you repaired for me last week has taken to stopping at irregular intervals. I beg you will attend tomorrow morning at 11. Pray be discreet, as my wife dislikes the smell of oil in the music room. Signed, L. Eastbury. Repaired last week, Holmes murmured. So you had already seen it in his house before yesterday? Yes, sir. I brought it myself. It had been delivered to my shop in Clerkenwell, and I cleaned and adjusted it. I returned it to Wimpole Street last Thursday. And at that time it was not cracked, nor stained, nor capricious? Not cracked, certainly. As for capriciousness, it had a tendency to lose a minute or two, but I corrected that. It ran correctly when I left it with him. That is why the note surprised me. Holmes rose and began to pace slowly before the fire, pipe in mouth, head slightly bowed. It is the pace of a mind that is walking among invisible objects. You will oblige me, Watson, said he, by fetching my notebook. This clock is anxious to tell us its story, but it will not do so to ears that are inattentive. I handed him the book, and he scribbled a few words. Mr. Alderwick, you will return to your shop for the moment, said he, but you will be good enough to remain within reach. Lestrade may be wrong, but he is never quiet. I shall need you again. The clockmaker looked uncertain. You mean you will go to Wimpole Street? At once. There is no more dangerous delusion than to suppose a thing can be left till tomorrow. A murder is most soluble while it is still fresh. You may expect a telegram. Alderwick stood, clearly torn between relief and dread. Mr. Holmes, he said earnestly, if you find that Miss Morland is innocent, if this is some other hand, then for God's sake prove it quickly. The house is in uproar, Mrs. Eastbury is half distracted, and Clara, she is proud, but she is kind. I cannot believe her capable of such a thing. Holmes looked at him with that sudden, keen directness which could be almost disconcerting. Belief is not our instrument, said he. Proof is. Then, softening a little, go now, and send to me by messenger any knowledge you possess of Mr. Eastbury's habits, his acquaintances, his purchases, anything, however small, concerning that clock or the man who owned it. When the door had closed behind Alderwick, Holmes turned to me. The little mantel clock sat between us, ticking with a steady innocence that belied the tale it had brought. "Well, Watson," said he, "shall we go and see what time has been doing in Wimpole Street?" "I confess," said I, drawing on my coat, "the locked room element perplexes me." "It is meant to," he answered, his eyes gleaming. "A locked door is a challenge, not a conclusion. Come, the fog may obscure London, but it does not obscure fact." We had scarcely descended to the street when the peculiar London morning swallowed us up. The fog, yellow as a lion's mane and thick as wool, rolled in slow billows about the lamp-posts and the black shapes of passing hansoms. Holmes hailed one with that curt authority of his, and in a moment we were rattling eastward toward Wimpole Street. During the drive he spoke little. His mind, I knew, was already in the music-room with the dead man and the clock. Yet now, and again he shot a question at me, not to learn. He never needed to learn from me in such matters, but to test the edges of his own thought. 20 minutes past 10, he murmured once, as if to himself. A chair overturned, blood spattered on the mantel, a smell of hot metal, and a clock that restarts itself at the precise moment a corpse is discovered. Curious. "You think the time is important, then?" "I think nothing yet. I observe. It is you who think." He smiled sideways. "But yes, the stopped hands are the first honest witnesses we have. Men may lie. Machinery, if properly understood, does not." We drew up at the tall Georgian house shortly after noon. A constable stood before it, taking shelter beneath the iron railings as though the very stones were in some way guilty. His collar was up, and he looked grateful to see Holmes's lean figure emerge from the cab. "Inspector Lestrade is inside, sir," said he. "Then let us interrupt his certainty," said Holmes, and pushed by. Even in the hall there was the faint sourness of upheaval, of hurried footsteps, of cold tea left standing, of the smell that a house acquires when calm domesticity has been pierced by violence. Hopkins the butler met us. He was a grave man with a long upper lip and a face drawn by shock. When he saw Holmes, he gave a little start of relief. "Mr. Holmes, sir, the inspector said you might come." "That was thoughtful of him. Lead the way." Hopkins ushered us along the corridor Alderwick had described. At its end stood the music-room door, now wide, with 2 policemen within. Lestrade himself was bending over a small side table, his hat pushed back, his sharp ferret face unusually flushed. "Holmes!" he cried. "This is devilish quick." "Quickness is not a vice in your trade, Lestrade," returned my friend. "You have made an arrest, I hear." Lestrade straightened, and his mouth set into that self-satisfied line I had come to associate with his premature conclusions. "Miss Morland, the evidence is as plain as a pikestaff." "We shall see whether it is not a painted pikestaff," said Holmes mildly. "May we look?" Lestrade shrugged. "Look as much as you like. It'll only confirm what I've told you." Holmes did not reply. He had already crossed the threshold with that noiseless tread which made him seem part of any room he entered. I followed, taking in with professional eyes the scene of the tragedy. The music-room was large and handsomely proportioned, with a bay window looking upon the grey squares of the morning. Along the walls stood cabinets of polished oak containing clocks of every variety. Their faces peered out at one from behind glass, solemn and indifferent, a parliament of time. There were tall mahogany long cases with moons and stars on their dials, gilded French clocks with cherubs and wreaths, a sober English bracket clock, and a squat black forest clock with carved stags. Most of them were still ticking. The effect was strange and almost horrible a chorus of measured beats in a room that had known sudden death. Before the fireplace, on a rug, lay the body of Mr. Lionel Eastbury. I shall spare the reader the full particulars, for they were brutal enough, but a few points must be stated. He was a stout man, richly dressed in a velvet smoking jacket. His throat had been cut from left to right with such force that the collar was nearly severed. The blood upon the rug had darkened and clotted. There was also blood on the lower lip of the mantel, on the carved leg of the small cabinet to the left, and in a thin crescent on the edge of the overturned chair. His face was turned slightly toward the hearth, his eyes half open with that fixed surprise which violence stamps upon the dead. Holmes knelt beside him, not as a man who is horrified, but as one who reads a page. He examined the hands, the nails, the pockets. He lifted the right arm where it lay pinned beneath the torso and studied the wrist. "No defensive cuts," he said quietly. "Why would there be?" scoffed Lestrade. "He knew his killer, took him by surprise." "Possibly, or he was incapable of defence at that moment for some other reason." Lestrade made a sound of impatience, but Holmes had already risen and was moving about the room with swift, bird-like turns of his head. He paused at the writing desk by the window. A sheaf of letters lay there, some sealed, some open. He did not read them yet, but noted their arrangement, ran his fingers along the inkstand, and sniffed like a hound testing air. "You smell it, Watson?" he asked suddenly. I bent and took in the air. A faint odour, yes, like burnt dust. "Hot metal," he corrected, "specifically heated brass. It lingers even now." He walked to the fireplace. Upon the mantel stood several ornaments. There was a bronze urn, a marble shepherdess, and in the centre a pale rectangular patch where something had been removed. At its edge, scarcely visible to my eyes until Holmes pointed, was a dark smear. "Blood," said he. Lestrade, who had tramped after him, peered. "Spatter from the cut, nothing more." "Spatter travels with direction. This is a drag." Holmes's long finger traced the faint streak. Something wet was moved across the mantel after the blood was shed. Something of this shape. He laid his hand flat where the removed object had stood. A mantel clock, perhaps? Lestrade grunted. "Alderwick took it away to show you. I told him to keep his hands off things, but he's an excitable tradesman." Holmes's eyes flicked to the clocks in the cabinets. "Which one is the Viennese piece?" "Not there now, obviously," snapped Lestrade. "Then I must imagine it for myself." He crouched, studying the foot of the mantel and the floor beneath. "See here, Watson." There were tiny shards of glass on the rug, glittering faintly. Holmes plucked one up with tweezers. "From the cracked face," I said. "Yes, but note the distribution. The fragments are not beneath the mantel where the clock stood. They are here, 4 feet out, near the chair. The blow that cracked the glass did not occur while the clock was peacefully on the mantel. It was struck, thrown perhaps, somewhere in the centre of the room, then returned." Lestrade opened his hands in exasperation. "What does that prove?" "A struggle. The girl could have grabbed it and flung it in temper, then set it back. She had time enough." Holmes gave him a look of mild pity. "Time enough for some things, Lestrade, not for all." He stood and turned his attention to the overturned chair. This was not kicked at random. The front leg is snapped clean, and there is blood on the broken edge. It was struck against something, or something against it, at the very moment of the wound. I ventured. "You mean the chair was used as a weapon? As a shield, perhaps, or as a support?" He tapped the chair's crest rail. "See the slight dent here? A hard, narrow object met it. A blade could do so if driven downwards at an angle." Lestrade's face grew a shade darker. Still harping on angles. The throat was cut, that's enough for me. Enough for a hanging, perhaps, not for truth. Holmes walked back to the body. Now the locked door. Hopkins. The butler stepped forward. You told Mr. Alderwick that Mr. Eastbury had been in here since 10? Yes, sir. He came down after breakfast. He said he did not wish to be disturbed. He locked the door from within. I heard the key turn. You heard it from the corridor? Yes, sir. I was just outside with the tray. How long did you remain? Perhaps a minute. He spoke to me through the door and told me to see that no one came. Then I went below. Holmes nodded. Did you hear anything else between 10 and the time you fetched the key? Hopkins swallowed. No, sir. Only the clocks. Clocks? Holmes repeated softly. Yes. Begging your pardon, sir, but when Mr. Eastbury was in a mood, he would set half the collection running at once. There was a great clatter of chimes and ticking. It went on for some time. Then it seemed to lessen. To lessen before 11? A little before, sir. I recall because the house felt quieter, but I thought nothing of it. Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew that something in that simple remark had struck him sharply. Thank you. You may go. As the butler withdrew, Holmes's gaze travelled once more around that solemn congregation of timepieces. For an instant his face was perfectly still, and in the hush I could hear the little differences in their beats, the slow, ponderous thud of a long case, the brisk patter of a French spring clock, the thin, nervous ticking of a watch in a cabinet. Then he spoke, very low, more to himself than to us. Someone here has altered time's testimony. The question is, how and to what end? Lestrade was in the act of replying with some sharp retort when an agitated rustle at the doorway caused us all to turn. A lady had entered, moving with a kind of proud unsteadiness, as though she were forcing each step upon herself. She was tall, dressed in deep mourning, with a veil pushed back from a face that was pale but finely cut. Her eyes were reddened from weeping, yet there was fire enough in them to show that sorrow had not extinguished spirit. Behind her, half in shadow, stood a slighter figure, a younger woman, equally pale, whose lips were pressed into a line of resolve that trembled in spite of itself. Inspector Lestrade, said the elder, and her voice, though low, carried the note of command which belongs to those who have long been obeyed. You have no right to keep my sister under guard as if she were a criminal. Clara has done nothing. I demand that she be released. Lestrade's manner, to do him justice, softened somewhat. The sight of grief never wholly failed to move him. Mrs. Eastbury, I'm sorry for you, but I've my duty. Your sister's movements are suspicious, and there's evidence— Evidence that you do not understand, broke in Holmes quietly. Mrs. Eastbury turned sharply toward him. For an instant I saw in her eyes that startled resentment of intrusion which a household in mourning so often feels toward the outsider. But the expression changed when she recognized him. "Mr. Holmes?" she said. "Lestrade told me you were here. If you have any power to help us, I beg you to use it. My husband is dead, and they would add to my misery by dragging my sister's name through the mud." Holmes bowed with grave courtesy. "You may depend upon my doing the only thing I ever do, madam, seeking the truth." His glance shifted to the younger woman. "Miss Morland, I presume?" She met his eyes steadily. "Yes." There was something in that steady meeting, something proud, almost defiant, which made me look at her more closely. She could not have been more than 25. Her dark hair was coiled plainly beneath her mourning bonnet. She was handsome in a keen, intelligent way, the kind of face where one expects candour rather than guile. Yet there was a rigidity in her shoulders, a tightness at the jaw, which spoke of a woman carrying fear without yielding to it. "Will you answer a few questions?" asked Holmes. "If it will end this absurdity, yes." Lestrade made a gesture with his hand. "You can question her all day, Holmes. She'll deny it till she's blue, but denial doesn't wipe away blood." Holmes ignored the comment, as one might ignore a barking dog while listening for a doorbell. "Miss Morland," said he, "you quarrelled with your brother-in-law this morning?" Her nostrils flared slightly. "We argued. I won't dress it up. Lionel and I have argued often." "About what, specifically today?" "About money." "Whose money?" "Mine. That is to say, what remains of my father's estate. Lionel managed it. He had no right, other than the convenience of being family. I told him I wished to withdraw my capital from his hands and place it with my own solicitor." "And he objected?" "He laughed. He treated me like a schoolgirl. He said I didn't understand investments and would ruin myself. I said I did understand enough to know I was being kept in ignorance." Holmes's eyes were on her face, not unkindly, but with that trained impartiality which made his sympathy, when it came, all the more convincing. "At what time was this conversation?" "Shortly after 10. I met him in the corridor outside this room. He had just come down from breakfast." "Did he go into the music room then?" "Yes. He was angry. He said he had more pressing matters than my hysterics, and went in here, locking the door behind him." "You did not follow?" "No, I went upstairs to my sister. I was shaking, and I needed to speak to someone who did not look at me as a nuisance." "Your sister can confirm that?" Mrs. Eastbury put a hand on Clara's arm. "She was with me in my sitting room at 10:30. She did not leave me." Lestrade snorted softly. "An alibi from a devoted sister isn't much use." Clara's eyes flashed. "You've already decided, Inspector." "I decide on facts," said he. Holmes lifted a hand, gentle but firm. "Let us keep to facts. Miss Morland, you had been staying in this house before?" "Yes, earlier this year." "You had a key to the music room at that time?" "I did. Lionel gave it to me because I practiced the pianoforte here." "And you returned it?" "Yes. To Hopkins. I left in April." "Very good. Now, the razor found in your room. Tell me of it." Her face paled further. "It is my travelling razor. I carry it because I do not like using household things. I cut my finger with it last night. That is the blood." Lestrade's eyebrows went up sceptically. "A neat story." "Not a story. Look at my hand." She held out her right forefinger. There was a small, half-closed cut upon it. It was, I confess, plausible enough. Holmes looked at it for scarcely a second before nodding. "So there is. How did you cut it?" "I was trimming a candle in my room. I slipped." "Did anyone see?" "No." Holmes's gaze did not rest on her longer than was necessary. He turned to Mrs. Eastbury. "Madam, your husband's habits. Did he have any enemies?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Lionel had the talent of making enemies without ever believing he had done so. He was not a cruel man, Mr. Holmes, but he was hard. He could be dismissive even to those who loved him." "Did he quarrel with anyone recently?" "Not that I know. He was occupied almost entirely with his collection. It consumed him." "Did he expect any visitors this morning?" "No." "Any special correspondence?" "I cannot say." "He received letters daily from dealers, collectors, auction houses. I did not pry. I have lived in a museum for 10 years. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement of the pain beneath her words. "Then perhaps the museum may explain the death." "One more question, madam. Did your husband ever have occasion to conceal anything from you that concerned his clocks? Any secret purchases? Any private dealings?" Mrs. Eastbury hesitated, then said slowly, "He was secretive about one thing. He had lately acquired a clock that he would not allow me to see closely. He said it was delicate, that he was waiting for Alderwick to repair it, yet he brought it into this room and kept it on the mantel. He would sit at night and watch it. I told Clara once that he looked like a man waiting for a friend he didn't trust. Holmes's head came up sharply. The Viennese clock? Yes. The one Alderwick brought last week. Lionel said it was rare, that it had a history. But he would not tell me what history. We were interrupted by the return of Hopkins, who hovered at the door in visible indecision until Holmes beckoned him in. "You wish to say something?" said Holmes. "Yes, sir. Begging your pardon, but the inspector said that any little thing might matter. There is a gentleman below, sir. He says his name is Mr. Silas Hargreaves, from the firm of Hargreaves and Holt. He is here about Mr. Eastbury's business. I said it was not a time—" "Hargreaves and Holt?" Holmes repeated. Lestrade shifted his weight. "A solicitor's firm," he said. "Eastbury's advisers, I believe." Mrs. Eastbury looked startled. "I know no Mr. Hargreaves." Clara's eyes widened a fraction, and though she said nothing, I saw her glance quickly to her sister. It was only for a moment, but Holmes caught it, as he caught everything. "Show him up," said Holmes. Hopkins vanished, and in another minute a man entered who was the very image of prosperous legality. He was short and broad, with thick side whiskers and a heavy gold watch chain across his waistcoat. His manner was voluble even in grief, as though business could not be silenced by death. "Mrs. Eastbury," he cried, bowing deeply. "Miss Morland, this is dreadful, dreadful. I came at once when I received Miss Morland's note. I had no idea, none. Inspector Lestrade, I presume? And Mr. Holmes, I have heard of you, sir." Holmes's expression was politely blank. "You received a note from Miss Morland?" "Yes. This morning she asked me to attend at 11 to discuss urgent matters of her estate. She wrote—" He fumbled for his pocketbook, then checked himself, remembering the room. "Forgive me, I have it downstairs." Clara spoke for the first time since Hopkins's announcement, her voice tight with astonishment. "I sent no such note." Hargreaves stared. "But, my dear madam, it was in your hand. I could swear it. It came by—" "Special messenger at 10:40. Lestrade's eyes gleamed. "There you are. 10:40. Precise time. A note to summon her lawyer after she'd had her row. What more do you want?" "What I always want," said Holmes softly, "is not more, but truer." He took a step toward Hargreaves. "Mr. Hargreaves, you will do me a kindness by going downstairs and fetching that note at once. Do not show it to anyone on the way. Bring it directly to me." "Certainly, certainly." The solicitor bobbed out. Holmes turned back to Clara and regarded her with a curious gentleness. "You did not send it? I believe you," said he. And though he offered no proof for the belief, the simple statement seemed to steady her more than any argument could have done. He glanced at Mrs. Eastbury. "Madam, may I ask you and your sister to withdraw for a few minutes? There are matters here which a lady ought not to witness." Mrs. Eastbury nodded gratefully. Clara hesitated, then followed her. When the door closed behind them, Lestrade rounded upon Holmes, triumphant and irritated at once. "Well, still think I'm painted? There's your motive plain. She wanted her money. She sends for her lawyer. The old man's found with his throat cut before the lawyer arrives. The room locked. Razor in her room. How many more signposts do you need?" Holmes looked at him with that tired amusement which one might give a child who insists that a toy compass must point north because it has been painted so. "I need only one signpost, Lestrade," said he. "But I insist on reading it the right way round." He stooped suddenly beside the cabinet to the left of the fireplace and pressed his fingers to its corner where the blood spatter had been. Then he held his fingertips to the light. "Dry," he remarked. "Older than the blood on the rug, not by hours, by days." Lestrade blinked. That's nonsense. Holmes straightened. Is it? Then why is there dust settled on the splashes? Why is there no trail between cabinet and body? Someone bled here earlier, lightly, and left it to be forgotten. Time remembered it, though, even if you did not. Before Lestrade could reply, there came footsteps on the stair, and Hargreaves re-entered, breathing hard, a folded paper in his hand. Here it is, Mr. Holmes. I apologize for my haste, but the house is, well, you know. Holmes took the note and opened it beneath the lamp. I read it over his shoulder. It was brief, written in a firm feminine hand. Dear Mr. Hargreaves, pray come to Wimpole Street at 11 this morning. It concerns my estate and must be settled without delay. Yours, Clara Morland? Holmes held it at arm's length, then closer. He turned it sideways to the light. He smelled it. Lestrade laughed harshly. Still want to tell me she didn't send it? Holmes's eyes never left the paper. No, said he. I want to tell you that this note is the first honest lie in the case. He handed it back to Hargreaves. Mr. Hargreaves, a question. How was the note sealed? Sealed? It wasn't. It was folded and slipped into an envelope. Unsealed. Just so. Holmes's voice sharpened slightly. And did you notice any scent? Hargreaves looked baffled. Why, yes, now you mention it. A faint, sweet smell, like something scorched. Holmes's gaze flashed to mine, and in that instant I saw the shape of a connection, though I could not yet grasp its meaning. Hot metal again, he murmured. Time, ink and heat. Come, Watson, there is more to learn before the clocks grow any older. Holmes remained for some moments with his eyes fixed upon the paper, as though it were a map in which the roads had been drawn by a deceitful hand. Then he moved with that sudden briskness which always signified that an internal conclusion had taken shape to the writing desk by the window. Lestrade, said he over his shoulder, you will oblige me by not arresting anyone else for the next quarter of an hour. I should dislike being compelled to undo 2 blunders instead of 1. Lestrade grumbled something indistinct, but he was too curious to leave. Hargreaves hovered, uncertain whether to go or stay, and I, knowing my friend's method, took up a position where I could watch and help. Holmes ran his fingers over the letters on the desk. He selected 3, opened all ready, and laid face down and spread them beneath the lamp. He did not read their contents at first. He examined the paper, the folds, the ink, the hand. Mrs. Eastbury said these were chiefly from dealers, he observed. This one is from Paris, this from Amsterdam, this from a London address in Jermyn Street. Observe the similarity of paper stock. He held one sheet between thumb and forefinger and snapped it lightly. Then he did the same with Hargreaves's note. Different, said I, for the contrast was plain even to my untrained senses. Exactly. Hargreaves's note is on a thinner, more fibrous paper, often used for short correspondence by ladies, because it takes ink quickly and lies flat. Yet it smells faintly of heated brass. The other letters do not, nor... He lifted the corner of the blotting paper and sniffed the desk surface. Does anything on this table? Lestrade shifted impatiently. For heaven's sake, Holmes, do you mean to tell me she heated her note over a stove to mask a murder? You're twisting yourself into knots. Holmes looked at him calmly. I mean that this note has been exposed to heat after it was written, or while it was being written. Ink behaves differently with warmth. So does paper. The question is what instrument of heat was at hand in this room at 10:40. He walked to the fireplace and leaned into the grate. The fire had long since died. Only a dull bed of ash remained. With his lens he peered, then extended a finger and drew out something tiny which he set upon the edge of his hand. "A brass shaving," he said, "still bright, freshly cut." "That could come from any of those clocks," Lestrade objected. "It could," said Holmes, "but it might also come from a clock that was opened and handled here this morning. A clock that contains brass and which might grow notably warm if a part were altered with friction or flame." He moved to the line of cabinets and opened one glass door after another, listening not to the chimes, but to the beats, his head cocked. At last he halted before a tall German musical clock. He did not touch it, only leaned close. "This one has been wound within the hour," he remarked. "The keyhole is polished with fresh contact, and there is a faint trace of oil on the rim. Yet Mr. Eastbury is dead, and no one claims to have wound it." Lestrade stared at him. "How in the devil can you tell that?" Holmes's glance flicked to the inspector's shoes. "Because you will observe a thread of oil on your own right boot, where you brushed against the case just now. You are quite careless, Lestrade, and you have infected my evidence." He eased the cabinet door shut. "Still it tells its tale." He turned, and his eyes found the stained cabinet corner again. "Watson, note also the position of that old blood," he said, "at a height of 3 feet from the floor, spattered outward, not down. A small wound in a right hand, perhaps, flung aside in annoyance, and here, on the floor beneath, a darker fleck that has been wiped." I stooped. He was right. There was a clean patch through the dust in a narrow crescent, as if a cloth had passed there before the rest settled. "Someone cleaned it," I said. "Someone tried to clean it, not thoroughly, not a housemaid's work. A hurried dab with a handkerchief, leaving the upper splashes to dry. Why in this room? Why days ago? And why does the present murderer wish the room to appear untouched?" Lestrade threw up his hands. "You're making a second crime out of a first. People cut themselves in houses all the time. The only wound that matters is Eastbury's throat." Holmes's reply was interrupted by a timid knock. The door opened and a woman entered with a tray in her hands. She was the maid, a young thing with frightened eyes. She started on seeing the body, then steadied herself, setting the tray down on a side table. "Beg pardon, sirs, Mrs. Eastbury thought you might want tea. She can't stay here." "Thank you," said Holmes gently. "What is your name?" "Annie, sir." "Annie, you were in the house this morning?" "Yes, sir." "Then you may help us. Did you see the messenger who brought Mr. Hargreaves's note?" The girl's face tightened with the effort of recalling amid distress. "I didn't see him plain, sir. I was at the top of the area steps with the milk. I heard the bell and Hopkins opened, and a man in a cap handed him the letter. He didn't come inside, he just turned away." "Quick. What sort of cap?" "A dark one, sir, like a workman's. I couldn't tell if it was a groom or a porter." "Height?" "About your height, sir, maybe a little shorter. Thin." Holmes nodded. "Did he speak?" "Only for Miss Morland, sir. He had a rough sort of voice." Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. "There! A rough voice! A workman's cap! That'd be a hired man, no doubt." Holmes lifted a hand. "One question more, Annie. After the messenger left, did anything unusual occur? Any noise from this room? Any smell?" The maid swallowed. "There was a smell, sir, yes. I noticed it in the passage when I came upstairs around 11:15, like when the cook scorches a pan. Only sharper, like hot pennies." Holmes's eyes warmed as if a lamp had been turned up behind them. "Hot pennies," he repeated. "Thank you. That is very clear." He turned to Lestrade. "You hear, Inspector? The smell was in the passage at 10:45, not confined to Miss Morland's room nor to her candle. It originates here." Lestrade was silent, but his jaw worked. Holmes poured a cup of tea for Annie with a kindness which in him always seemed more striking because so unforced. "Go to your mistress. Tell her I will not be long," said he, and ask Hopkins to come. When the maid had fled, Holmes crossed quickly to the mantel and examined the pale patch again. He bent so low that the lamplight shone on the fine bones of his face. "See this, Watson," he said. A shallow crescent of indentation in the wood, a clock's foot sat here. If I had the Viennese clock in place, I could tell you which foot and how much strain it bore. "You think it was moved recently?" I said. "I think it was moved violently, in a manner to crack its glass, and returned in a hurry." The returning left a faint skid in the dust. He straightened, and his voice fell to one of those quiet confidences he used with me alone. A hinged front, a brass movement, a spring escapement. A man who knows clocks could open it, heat a part, and close it in 3 minutes. To what end? To make a clock remember a time it did not truly keep. I confess I stared at him. "You mean—" "Not yet," said he softly. "Let us fetch one more stone for the cairn before we look at the whole mound." Hopkins entered at that moment, his face pinched with anxiety. "You wanted me, sir?" "Yes." "Hopkins, did you ever smell anything hot from this room before today? Any burning odour?" The butler hesitated. "Once, sir. 2 nights ago. Mr. Eastbury was in here late. I came to ask if he wanted supper, and there was a sharp smell like metal. He said one of the clocks was acting up, and I was not to trouble myself." "Which clock?" "He was standing by the mantel, sir. By the new one." "Did anyone visit him that evening?" Hopkins cleared his throat. "There was a gentleman, sir. An acquaintance. From the trade, I think. He came about 8. Mr. Eastbury took him straight in here. I heard raised voices, then quiet. The gentleman left in a hurry at 9, and when I brought a tray later, Mr. Eastbury's right hand was bandaged. Holmes's head came up like a hound that has caught scent. A bandage, fresh? Yes." He spoke very gently. "Do you know the gentleman's name?" "No, sir. Mr. Eastbury did not announce it. He was not one to." "Describe him." "A foreign sort, sir. Dark moustache. A little stooped. He wore a travelling coat and his boots were wet with fog. I should say he was not of our class." Lestrade took a half step forward, interest overcoming hesitation. "You didn't mention this before." "You did not ask, Inspector," said Hopkins stiffly, "and there has been much confusion." Holmes's gaze held the butler an instant longer. "One last thing, Hopkins. This morning, when you heard Mr. Eastbury lock the door at 10, did the clocks chime at all afterward?" Hopkins frowned in concentration. "They did at first, sir. He was winding and setting them. I heard the little Dutch one strike the quarter, and the long case in the far corner chime 10, then no more chimes until near 11, when everything seemed quieter." Holmes nodded slowly. "Quieter because several clocks had been stopped," he murmured. "Stopped to cover a sound, stopped to confuse a time, stopped because time, inconveniently, was about to tell the truth." He turned on Lestrade in a sudden crispness. "Inspector, who is guarding Miss Morland?" "Constable Doyle at her door." "Good. Remove him. She is not to be harried. And send a man at once to Clerkenwell to fetch Mr. Alderwick to me here." Lestrade opened his mouth to protest, thought better of it, and strode out with a muttered oath. Holmes looked around once more at the silent, respectful clocks. "Watson," said he in a low voice, "we have a forger who uses heat, a visitor who knew the Viennese clock intimately, an old bloodstain from 2 nights ago, and a room full of timepieces suddenly hushed at the very hour a man's throat was cut. I begin to suspect that the murderer did not so much enter a locked room as command it." "And how does a man command a locked room?" Holmes's mouth curved. "By arranging that the room believes itself locked, while he stands on the safe side of time. There are moments in my friend's investigations when I feel as if he stands upon some height from which the rest of us are shut out by mist. I can see that the air about him has cleared, that the landscape is sharp to his eye, yet to me it is all grey distances and uncertain shapes. So it was now. His last remark had in it a suggestion so startling that I could only stare. On the safe side of time, I repeated. Holmes had already crossed to the bay window and drawn the curtain a hand's breadth wider. The dull winter light fell upon the writing desk, the chairs, and the dark, silent face of death by the hearth. He seemed to drink the room in once more, not with the general glance of a man taking a view, but with the minute exactness of one memorizing a diagram. "Consider what we have," said he. A locked door, which every witness affirms was locked at 10. A body discovered at 11. A clock on the mantel, which was stopped at 20 past 10, and then, as Audiobook says, resumed its beat upon the entrance of the discoverers. A cluster of clocks that chimed at first and then fell oddly quiet. The smell of heated brass in the passage at 10:45. A forged note timed at 10:40. A visitor 2 nights ago who left the deceased with a bandaged hand and the same smell in the room. These things are not scattered, they are arranged. Arranged by whom? I asked. By a man who wishes to place the murder within a particular hour and to divert suspicion to a particular person. He has taken pains with time because time is the one witness he cannot bribe, so he has attempted to tamper with it. As he spoke, there came steps in the corridor, briskly approaching. Lestrade returned, his face bearing the look of a man who has swallowed pride with difficulty. "I've sent for Audiobook," said he gruffly. "He'll be here presently, and I've taken my man off the lady's door, though I'll have you know—" "Your restraint does you credit," replied Holmes smoothly. "Now, Inspector, I must ask you to do another thing which will offend your sense of order. Permit me to speak with Miss Morland alone for 5 minutes." Lestrade's brows shot up. "Alone?" "Alone. You may wait outside if you prefer. You may place a constable at the top of the stairs so that no one leaves the landing." "You're mad, Holmes." "Perhaps. But not in the way you mean. Come, Watson." We left Lestrade in the corridor, muttering to himself, and were shown by Hopkins to a small withdrawing room on the first floor. Here, beside a window, sat Clara Morland. She rose at our entrance, a portrait of anxious composure. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "have you convinced him yet that I am not a butcher?" Holmes bowed. "I have convinced him of nothing, but I have learned much, and I should like to learn a little more from you. I will not keep you long." She looked from him to me, then sat again. "You believe I did not send that note?" "I do." "Then you have my gratitude, though I do not know why you are certain." "I am never certain without reason. But let us approach that later. Miss Morland, you said you went upstairs to your sister after your quarrel. At what time did you reach her?" "A little after 10, perhaps 10:20. We spoke until the alarm was raised." "Did anyone come to you during that time? Any servant? Any message?" "No." "Did you hear any sound from the music room? A cry, a fall, a chime?" She closed her eyes a moment. "I heard the clocks. They were all going at once, as they often are when Lionel is excited. They were loud, then they seemed to stop, one by one. It was as if the house was sinking into silence." "At what time did you notice that?" "I cannot be exact. Near 11, I think. Perhaps a little before." "Very good. Now tell me of this solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves. You say you did not summon him?" "Certainly not. I have not spoken to him for months." "Yet you intended to speak to a solicitor today, did you not?" Her face tightened. "I intended to write to Mr. Hargreaves this afternoon. Not to summon him here. I meant to take my papers and go to his office." "Had you said so to anyone besides the deceased?" "No, only to Lionel." Holmes's eyelids lowered a fraction. Then the forged note was crafted by someone who knew both your handwriting and your intention. I suppose so. Who in this house could imitate your hand? She hesitated, then said reluctantly, My sister might if she chose. We were schooled together. Holmes's head moved in the smallest negative. I do not ask you to accuse your sister. I ask you to think of others. Did your brother-in-law ever show your letters to anyone? Did any dealer or acquaintance ever see you write? There are people, she said slowly. Collectors who dine here, men from the trade. Lionel liked to boast about the estate matter, as if it were some game of control. He would wave my letters about and laugh. I hated it. Names? Mr. Vernon Brixham, a dealer in Jermyn Street, Mr. Latham from Sotheby's, and a foreign gentleman lately, one who came twice in the last week. I do not know his name. He spoke with an accent. He was thin, dark, with a moustache. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen. Did you see him clearly? Yes, he was in the dining room 3 nights ago. He sat near Lionel, and they spoke in low tones. Lionel was in a mood that night, irritable, restless. After supper, he took the man into the music room. I heard them arguing through the door. Arguing about what? I could not make out the words, but I heard Lionel say something like, It is mine by right of purchase, and the other replied, not by right of memory. Those were the only phrases I caught. Holmes was very still. Not by right of memory, he repeated softly. Yes, it was a strange thing to say. I remember because it chilled me. Did the man leave? Yes, about 9. He brushed past me in the corridor. His eyes were hard. She shivered. Soon after, Hopkins said Lionel had cut his hand. Holmes leaned forward. Did you see the bandage? Only at supper the next evening. His right hand was wrapped, and he was angry if anyone looked at it. He said he had been careless with a spring. Thank you. Holmes rose. I have no more questions. Clara stood as well, with an almost desperate eagerness. Mr. Holmes, will you tell me what you think? I cannot bear this, waiting. He regarded her with a gentleness that I think she had not expected from so cold a reputation. I think you have endured enough to be owed honesty, Miss Morland. But honesty without proof is merely kindness, and kindness is not the coin of justice. Trust me a little longer. She inclined her head, biting her lip, and we withdrew. In the corridor, Lestrade awaited us, his arms folded, and his face a battlefield between irritation and curiosity. Well? Holmes lit his pipe with deliberate calm. Well, Inspector, your case against Miss Morland has weakened rather than strengthened. Lestrade gave a snort. You're turned by a pretty face. I am turned only by facts. She did not send the note. We now have a distinct description of the foreign visitor who argued with Eastbury and used the word memory in connection with ownership. You will recollect that Hopkins mentioned such a visitor and a hand wound 2 nights ago. You will further recollect an old blood spatter in the music room at a height consistent with a wounded right hand. These are converging lines, Lestrade. When lines converge, they point. Lestrade opened his mouth to retort, but at that moment the bell below rang sharply, followed by Hopkins's measured steps. He appeared at the landing. Mr. Alderwick is here, sir. Excellent, said Holmes. Bring him up, straight to the music room. A minute later the clockmaker stood again among the ticking cabinets, looking more harassed than before, his keen craftsman's eyes flying to the body and away from it. Holmes did not spare him the sight of death. He knew better than most men that truth is seldom found in comfort. Mr. Alderwick, said he, you repaired the Viennese clock last week. Did you observe anything peculiar about its mechanism beyond the escapement irregularity you mentioned? Alderwick swallowed. It was an odd piece, sir. beautifully made, but there was a secondary wheel within the case, not part of the striking train. I had never seen its like. I thought perhaps it was for some secret alarm or complication, though I could not say what. "Secondary wheel," Holmes repeated. "Did you remove it?" "No, sir, I did not dare. It was set behind a small brass plate, secured by 2 screws. The screws were newer than the rest of the movement, recently replaced." "By whom?" "I cannot know." "But you noticed their newness?" "Yes, the heads were sharp, not worn by repeated keying." Holmes nodded slowly. "Could that wheel generate heat if set in motion improperly?" "It might, sir, if it jammed or rubbed against the plate. But only for a short time." "Short time is all a murderer needs." Holmes drew the Viennese clock from his coat pocket. He had carried it with him through the house, as a man carries a loaded pistol, and set it on the table beneath the lamp. Alderwick gave a little cry, half of recognition, half of grief. "That is it." Holmes opened the back with a deft movement and exposed the shining brass within. His fingers were swift and sure, yet he did not touch a thing without purpose. "Here is your secondary wheel," said he. "Mr. Alderwick, look at this plate. Whose screwdriver has been here since you last closed it?" The clockmaker bent close, his face paling. "Mine has not, sir. The screws are turned freshly, and good God, one is scorched at the edge." Holmes's gaze met mine for an instant, and I felt the chill of that silent communication. "Scorched," he said. "And if scorched, heated, and if heated, used. You see, Lestrade, the clock does remember things. It remembers being tampered with by a hand that knew exactly which wheel to wake and which time to silence." It was not until late that afternoon that Holmes would permit any of us to leave the music room. He had the table cleared of ornaments, and set the Viennese clock there like a small dark idol before which all were invited to stand. Lestrade paced, nettled and fascinated. Alderwick hovered in a craftsman's misery. Mrs. Eastbury and Clara had been brought down once more at Holmes's request, and now waited with the strained patience of those who have given themselves into another's hands. Hargreaves lingered near the doorway, his business instincts battling with a sincere human discomfort at being so near death. The fog had thickened outside. Inside, the clocks went on ticking, but to my ears their chorus had changed. Each beat seemed an impatient finger tapping for the answer Holmes held. He closed the back of the Viennese clock and set his palms lightly upon its case. "Before we speak of men," said he, "let us speak of time. This house is full of timepieces because Mr. Eastbury loved them, and because he loved them, he was murdered with one." Lestrade made a restless movement. "I tell you again, Holmes, he was murdered with a razor." Holmes shot him a glance of mild reproof. "With a razor, certainly, but the means by which the razor could be used in a locked room, at an hour falsely certified, and with a false trail laid to Miss Morland, lies here." He tapped the Viennese clock. "It is not merely a pretty case with wheels, it is a contrivance of memory." Mrs. Eastbury drew a breath. "You mean it was designed for some trick?" "For a purpose," said Holmes softly. "A sinister one in its origin, though perhaps innocent when first conceived. Mr. Alderwick has already told us of a secondary wheel behind a brass plate. When I opened the clock a few minutes ago, you observed that the screws had been freshly turned and one scorched. The mechanism had been interfered with since it left Mr. Alderwick's hands. Why, to activate what the maker intended should be secret." Alderwick stared. "I thought it might be an alarm." "So it is. But not an alarm for burglars, an alarm for time itself." He took a small screwdriver from his case and, without removing the plate entirely, tilted it so that we could see within. I saw the secondary wheel, a slender toothed disc engaged with a spring of peculiar arrangement. Holmes pointed with the end of the tool. This wheel is not part of the striking train. When engaged by moving this catch, it places friction upon the escapement. The clock slows, hesitates, and if the friction is increased, it stops. Then, when the friction is released, it resumes, a simple affair in principle, but devilishly useful to a man who wishes a clock to bear false witness. The heat comes from the friction, hence the smell of hot pennies in the passage at 10:45, hence the scorched screw. Lestrade frowned. You're saying someone stopped it at 10:20? I am saying someone made it seem to stop at 10:20, Holmes replied. It was not capricious. It was obedient. It was told to remember a time chosen for it. He stepped to the mantel and pointed to the pale patch. Where did it stand? Here. When Mr. Eastbury entered at 10, he set the room clamouring with chimes. That was his habit. He wanted noise because he expected a confrontation and did not wish the household to hear its words. Miss Morland met him in the corridor. They quarrelled. He went in and locked the door from within. Hopkins heard the key turn. All true so far. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Mrs. Eastbury leaned forward. Expected a confrontation? With whom? She whispered. With the foreign gentleman who visited him 2 nights ago, said Holmes. The man Miss Morland heard say not by right of memory. A man who had already bled in this room and left that old spatter on the cabinet. He turned to Hopkins. You described him. Thin, dark moustache, travelling coat. Annie saw a thin workman cap figure deliver the forged note at 10:40. Miss Morland saw the same man at supper. These are the same person. He is not a mere dealer. He is Matthias Vaughan, a clockmaker of Vienna, lately of Haarlem, and the original owner of this clock. Alderwick gave an inarticulate cry. Lestrade's head snapped up. Vaughan, I've a note from the Dutch police about a fellow of that name, wanted for fraud in Utrecht. How the devil? Holmes raised a hand. Fraud and worse. But let us keep to our line. This clock came to Mr. Eastbury from Haarlem, yes? It was sold to him by a dealer who did not wish his name known. Mr. Eastbury found it rare, with a history, watched it at night, wouldn't let his wife touch it. Why? Because within the case he discovered a hidden compartment, very neatly made behind the movement. Mr. Alderwick, you never saw it because you did not strip the case. Mr. Eastbury did, for he was a collector, and curiosity is his trade. Within that compartment were papers, letters, proof of a crime committed long ago in Vienna. A murder in which this clock had been present, and which it had been built to record. Mrs. Eastbury put a hand to her throat. A murder recorded by a clock? Holmes inclined his head. It is less fanciful than it sounds, madam. Certain ingenious minds have made mechanisms to trip at set times, to stop or start when a latch is pressed, to print a mark upon a drum when a hidden lever is touched. This clock contained such a lever. It was intended by Vaughan's father, who was a master craftsman in the service of a noble house, to note a secret meeting hour, perhaps even to expose a killer. When the nobleman was found dead, the clock disappeared. The family fell. Young Vaughan kept the clock not for its beauty, but because in its hidden papers lay his family's disgrace and his father's chance at revenge. Lestrade stared at the clock as if it had grown teeth. And Eastbury found these papers? He did. And being what he was, hard, acquisitive, and a little vain, he did not go to the police. He wrote instead to Vaughan through the Haarlem dealer. He offered to return the papers for money, not blackmail he would have called it. A transaction. That was the quarrel 2 nights ago. Vaughan came here at 8, demanded the papers, and Eastbury refused unless paid. They struggled here by the mantel. Vaughan cut his hand on the clock's secondary wheel when Eastbury slammed the case shut upon his fingers. The blood spattered the cabinet. Vaughan, left furious and desperate. Clara half rose. Lionel was blackmailing him. He was bargaining with a man who had no bargaining left in him, said Holmes. Vaughan went away and planned a cleaner exchange, one without witnesses. This morning he returned. Lestrade thrust his chin forward. But how did he get into a locked room? Holmes's eyes glittered. By making the locked room lock itself behind him while he was already inside it. He walked to the far corner and opened a small door I had not noticed before, set low in the wood panelling. This is a service cupboard that communicates with the corridor through a narrow passage used for sweeping the flues. It is not secret, merely overlooked. Vaughan discovered it when he visited. He entered by it today before 10, probably while Annie was at the milk. He hid within. Eastbury entered at 10, locked the main door from inside, and began winding the clocks, unaware of the man crouched 3 yards away. Lestrade's mouth fell open. But Hopkins said he heard voices no more after 10. Because Eastbury never knew he was confronted until the moment of the attack, said Holmes, and because Vaughan did what a clockmaker can do better than most men, he controlled sound. When he slipped from the cupboard, he moved first to this cabinet. Holmes crossed to the German musical clock. He had already rehearsed it. He opened cases, released clickworks, and stopped several clocks. The house grew quieter, as Hopkins noted. Why? To ensure that when the razor did its work, the soft scuffle, the fall of a chair, the brief gasp, could not be heard above a chorus of chimes. Mrs. Eastbury swayed. Clara caught her arm. "And the time?" I asked. "Why stop the Viennese clock at 10:20? Because Vaughan needed an hour of death that permitted his escape and framed Miss Morland. He killed Eastbury not at 10:20, but nearer to 10:50. After the cut, he flung the Viennese clock from the mantel into the room, thus cracking its glass and dropping the shards near the chair. This was to create the appearance of a struggle around the early time. He then returned it to the mantel and engaged the secondary wheel so that its hands slowed and stopped at 10:20, though the real time ran on. That is why Alderwick saw it stopped there when he entered at 11. The moment the door opened, Vaughan, who was already out, had left the catch so lightly engaged that the vibration of footsteps released it. The clock resumed, a dutiful liar caught by circumstance. Lestrade found his voice at last. And the forged note to Hargreaves. To fix motive and timing. Holmes's fingers drummed once on the clock case. Vaughan had seen Miss Morland's letters. He had perhaps handled one while dining here. With a little practice he could mimic her firm downward strokes. He wrote quickly in a hand-passable imitation, then dried and darkened the ink over the warmed brass plate of this clock's interior. Hence the scent upon the note and Hargreaves's memory of scorched sweetness. He dispatched it at 10:40 by messenger, so that Hargreaves could arrive just after the discovery and testify unwittingly to Clara's motive before the blood was even dry. Clara's lips parted, white with fury. He used my hand against me. Precisely. Lestrade took a step toward Holmes, almost unwilling admiration breaking through. And after the murder, he went back through that cupboard? He did not need to go back through it. He left by the main door after he had locked it from the outside, with a key already in his possession. "A duplicate key?" Lestrade said. "From his earlier visit," returned Holmes. "A thin man, a thin file, and a servant's inattention are all that are required. He could lock the door after he left and still make it appear that it had never been opened. The locked room was a stage prop. The clocks were his orchestra." A long silence followed in which only the steady ticking dared to speak. I saw in Mrs. Eastbury's face the agony of understanding, and in Clara's the tight relief of innocence reclaimed. Alderwick looked as if someone had struck his own heart with a hammer. Lestrade drew a great breath. "All very pretty, Holmes, but where is this Vaughan now? Your story hangs without a man to put a rope round." Holmes smiled, and that smile was the final click of a mechanism coming to rest. "He is close. A man who kills for a thing does not leave that thing behind. He will come for the clock tonight." Lestrade stared. "You're keeping it here?" "I'm keeping a copy here," said Holmes tranquilly. "The clock itself is no longer in this room." He turned to me. "Watson, you will recall the cab we took from Baker Street. I told the driver to stop at Clerkenwell before coming on. While you paid him, I went into Alderwick's shop and left the Viennese clock there in his safe, instructing his apprentice to tell any foreign gentleman who inquired that it was to be delivered to Mr. Eastbury's solicitor this evening. Vaughan will go there. He cannot resist the papers. They are his life." Lestrade's eyes shone. "You laid a trap, as one must, to make time speak in a language even murderers understand. There are 2 constables at Alderwick's shop now in plain clothes. I have also telegraphed to a certain office in Bow Street, where a description of Vaughan will be well received. If he comes as I think, you will have him within the hour." As if in answer to his words, there came a hurried footfall on the stairs, and a constable burst into the room, breathless. "Inspector, we've got him. A foreign fellow at Clerkenwell. He tried to force the safe and, when challenged, turned like a rat. He's under guard now." Lestrade gave a bark of triumph. "Good man, keep him there. I'll come." He swung toward Holmes, half angry, half elated. "You're a cold-blooded devil, Holmes, but you're right." Then, to Mrs. Eastbury and Clara, his tone changed to a rough gentleness. "Ladies, I'm sorry. Looks like you're cleared." Mrs. Eastbury sank into a chair, her face in her hands. Clara stood rigid, eyes fixed on the clock as though she would have smashed it if not for her sister's grief. They took Vaughan that night. He fought savagely at first, but broke under the weight of the hidden letters when Holmes produced them. The confession was short, bitter, and stripped of embroidery. He did not deny the killing. He spoke of his father disgraced, of a nobleman dead in Vienna, of a clock built to witness a secret hour and then stolen away by the very man it was meant to expose. He spoke of years of hiding and of Eastbury's greed waking the old wound like a spring uncoiling. He wept only once when Holmes set the Viennese clock before him and asked if it was worth a life. He did not answer. When all was done and the house on Wimpole Street had fallen into a quiet that felt at last like peace rather than conspiracy, Holmes and I walked home through the drifting fog. "You are satisfied?" I asked. "Satisfied?" He drew his coat tighter against the chill. "No, only concluded. Satisfaction is for those who believe the world improves by being explained. The best we can do is prevent it worsening." "And the clock?" said I. He gave that little shrug of his. "Timepieces are innocent, Watson. They remember only what hands force them to remember. The tragedy is not that a clock lied, but that men are so eager to make it do so." We had reached Baker Street. The familiar lamplight gleamed through the haze like a home port after rough sea. Holmes paused upon the step and looked back once toward the swallowed city. "Come," said he, "there is coffee inside, and perhaps, if London is kind, something less sorrowful than a man murdered by his own collection, though I warn you, in this town even time has a way of turning treacherous." And with that he went in, already half lost in thought, while I followed as I have always followed, astonished, chastened, and grateful to have walked, however humbly, beside the keenest mind of our age.